YouTube, it's Faye, and for today's video, we've got this sweet little Lexus GS 300 in the shop. I know it's not a Supra, but it's got a 2JZ under the hood, so close enough. It belongs here. It was towed in over the holidays because it died on the highway and wouldn't restart, leaving the owner stranded after he had only purchased it 2 days prior. According to the owner, the check engine light started flashing and it was running really poorly, and he was able to get it to the side of the road, but then it died and it would not restart. So let's back up, head outside, and let's check this thing out. Wow, on first glance, it's extremely clean under the hood for having over 300,000 miles on it. Well, except for this valve cover gasket leak, a very common issue on these with higher mileages. I'll make a note of that and recommend that repair. Now, since the check engine light was flashing, I do want to scan for codes. I'm trying out a new tool today. I just got this gear wrench scan tool, so let's try it out. I really like the visuals of the tool checking the bus. All right, we can see multiple Misfire as well as cylinder 1 and 6. This is exactly what I expected to see since the customer described the flashing check engine light. And from my extensive experience with these vehicles, I happen to know that cylinder 1 and 6 are controlled by the same coil. After seeing the valve cover gasket leak, I definitely have a clue as to what is going on here. Although that doesn't explain why the car wouldn't restart after it died on the highway. So before I attempt to replicate the condition and see what's going on, I'm just gonna take a quick peek at the timing belt just to make sure that I won't cause any more harm than good by turning the engine over. Sweet, it looks fantastic. Let's move forward with attempting to fire it up. Wow, nothing. Like, really nothing. I didn't even hear the starter relay click at all. Okay, let's review the wiring diagram real quick. What comes before the relay? Well, we have the AM2 15 amp fuse. I grabbed my multimeter, did a quick continuity check across the fuse, got nothing, pulled it out and saw that it was indeed blown. See, that one has continuity, makes noise. That one has continuity. That one does not. It's got my little fuse pullers. Love this tool. Oh yeah, plain as day, that guy is blown. Well, what caused it to blow? We'll have to figure that out. In the meantime, let's see if replacing it will allow the engine to start and verify that the rest of the starting system is good. Yep, but the check engine light is definitely flashing at me and I can hear the poor thing misfiring. All right, let's pull the Lexus into the shop real quick and take a better look at what's going on under the hood. Maybe we can find the source of what caused that fuse to blow too. Now, I had mentioned that I already knew that cylinder 1 and 6 were controlled by the same coil, so that's where I started looking. I went to unplug the connector before loosening that 10mm bolt that secures the coil to the cylinder head, and look, the pin wasn't even seated in the plug. Hopefully that's the only problem, but let's check out that coil too, just in case. I'm worried that it's gonna be saturated in oil.
Oh my God. I'm sorry, what?
The coil is destroyed. Checking out the rest of the wiring, coils, and wires, I recommend replacing every coil, wire, and the leaking valve cover gasket. Oh, and a full rebuild of the coil pack wiring harness. Thankfully, the customer approved the work, and I was able to move forward with repairing the car. Starting with my 10mm socket and loosening these 2 clamps to pull off the plastic air intake pipe, then removing this hose on the back side of the pipe, which is just held into place loosely with a spring clamp, and we can pull this tube right off and set it aside, exposing some electrical connectors that we will need to remove. I found it was easier to get to the TPS connector after removing the PCV hose first, and I used my 90-degree pliers to remove the clamp and just turned it out of the way. Then I was able to disconnect the TPS connector and this other PCV hose, which as soon as I touched it, I knew it had to be replaced because it was so spongy and oil saturated. So I pulled the whole thing off and removed the outer protective sleeve. It was so collapsed and floppy that it actually made me laugh. Okay, I don't know why. I guess this is what happens when you spend so much time alone. You start to go a little nutso. Anyway, there's a little VSV on the back side of the metal intake pipe there. So I loosened the 10mm fastener and let the valve flop to the side, keeping its hoses connected. I put the 10mm bolt back in its hole there. With that out of the way, these 2 other vacuum hoses were exposed underneath that also are connected to the intake manifold. I didn't bother labeling them before removal because they're 2 very different diameter hoses. Now this is a water-cooled throttle body, so we have the coolant in and out lines to remove. Be sure to have a rag handy. You will obviously drip a little coolant here, but it's so minor that I never really see the need to drain the coolant for this job. Just let it drip a bit and clean it up at the end. I'll get to the other one in a bit. I'm first going to remove this throttle cable, which I did mark prior to removal, but to be honest, I did end up adjusting this at the end of this service because I thought it was too loose. I used two 14mm wrenches to hold and loosen the adjustment nuts and snaked the cable out of the throttle linkage. Now I've got my 12mm socket because I was going to remove the nuts for this insulator bracket that attaches the throttle body to the cylinder head. But in my case, however, the bushings were broken and detached from the metal, which I realized once I had one of the nuts removed. So I actually ended up leaving this in place. I'll remove the wire harness clip here from the bracket and then disconnect this connector. Next, I move on to disconnecting the throttle body and upper intake manifold section because the other coolant hose and one more vacuum line are actually easier to disconnect once we can tilt this piece up and fit our hands underneath a little better. I loosen every 12mm fastener by hand first, 4 bolts on top and 2 nuts below. Then I go back in with battery power where I can make things a little faster. Once the fasteners are all removed, I pop the manifold forward, then tilt it back to access this little vacuum hose, which is easy to forget when reinstalling this piece, so I like to mark it in purple so it stands out. And then lastly, this coolant hose for the throttle body is easiest to get from underneath in my opinion. So I'll grab this one last before removing the throttle body and upper intake manifold as a unit. Now I'm pulling this PCV valve off and replacing this as well after seeing the condition of that hose. And let's get this timing belt cover back off so we can access the rest of the coils and wires and of course remove the valve covers to replace their gaskets. Oh man, look at this wiring in here. Oh my God! What the? Where did? What? Okay, where did that even go? This one had no connector on it. Are you kidding me? And those are just out and touching. I'm gonna have to rebuild this entire harness. There's no getting around it. Oh God, how deep does it go? At this point, I decided to start digging into the wire harness just to see how bad everything was, so I knew how far I had to go in replacing everything. I also noticed this cracked corrugated sheathing material on the oxygen sensor harness and melted connector, so I made a mental note to repair this and reroute everything properly later on in this service. I removed the crumbling plastic and did check the wires and everything felt good, so thankfully I don't have to completely replace this too. The plastic connector cover pretty much disintegrated in my hands as I tried to pull it up, but I had to trace these wires back until they weren't corroded and brittle. These sit under the timing cover anyway, and I have a way to replace this piece, so not to worry. Now let's get my 10mm socket and pull out these other 2 coils. Let's pull these wires out of here and let's clean the oil out of the spark plug galley. Oh my God, look how bad it is. Don't mind the teeny bit of coolant in there from disconnecting those little hoses earlier. It's the oil down in here that I'm talking about. I'm gonna spray a little degreaser in there to break up the oil, and then I scrub the area clean. I obviously spent a lot of time on this, but I'm not gonna bore you with that. While I'm here, I'm gonna pull a spark plug and see if they have actually been recently replaced. A big red flag the customer told me was the seller had just replaced the spark plugs before I bought it. Yeah, I'm sure the previous owner sold this car for a reason. After he destroyed these coil pack connectors trying to do the spark plugs himself, there's always a reason a vehicle is for sale, folks. Turns out, yes indeed, the spark plugs were new. He probably should have just left the car alone before the sale. Okay, it's finally time to start tackling these valve covers. I've got my 10mm socket and I'm removing all 8 of these bolts. The back 2 are a little tricky because of the heater hoses. And let's pull this passenger side valve cover off. I'm inspecting the camshaft and also cleaning off the sealing surface, making sure that no degreaser or coolant makes its way into the cylinder head while I cover this over with a rag while I clean and prep the valve cover and replace the gasket. I have to say, it looks really clean in there for 305,000 miles. Okay, we've got some fail pros. Just kidding. These are fine for this style of rubber gasket. There's 3 here, who knows why? Probably for a different model. Let's remove this current gasket and clean up the sealing surfaces as best we can. There's some old RTV of some sort that was all slopped on there in the past that's gotten very hard and brittle, and I don't want it to mess up the new seal. Now let's get the old gasket and match it up with the correct one for the exhaust side. Wait a second, what am I talking about? This valve cover looks like total crap. Let's clean it up for the customer first. He's totally the type of person to pop the hood and inspect the end result, so I want him to feel good about the money he's spending on my labor for this job. I'm using a little brake parts cleaner, a little degreaser, and a Scotch-Brite abrasive pad. Now that it is sufficiently clean, I will install the gasket. Before reinstalling the valve cover, there are only 2 spots that I like to put a little form-in-place gasket, unlike the last person who did this job and just put it everywhere. These 2 90-degree corners at the front of the gasket sealing surface is the only place, and I do a small pea-sized amount in each corner. To reinstall, I start with the back first and snake the cover underneath those heater hoses, then lift the wire harness up and over the front of the cover. I do a quick visual inspection to make sure the gasket stayed in place during installation. Now I'm wiping the dirt and oil off of each one of my bolts before reinstalling them by hand first, then a little gentle battery power to snug them into place, starting with the inside bolts and working my way to the outside. I did have to use hand tools on the rear two bolts just due to the proximity to the firewall. I'll do a final torque a little later once I do the other valve cover. Speaking of the other valve cover, let's get it! I suppose I don't really have to walk you through this step by step again, as the process for both sides is identical. So let's speed through this removal, cleaning, new gasket, some form and place gasket in the corners there, and reinstallation. Cool! Once again, all these little 10mm bolts are going in by hand, then gentle battery power. According to Lexus, these are called the number 1 and number 2 cylinder head cover, and the torque specification for these is 74 inch-pounds. Let's get it! Now I'm going to install the new ignition coils. I have 3 new ignition coils, and in the boot of each one, I'm going to be putting a little bit of this silicone paste. Now, on the off chance that this ever happens again, which hopefully it does not, this just helps create a barrier from the oil that could potentially get in there and cause a misfire. So now I'm installing these new coils using a little dielectric grease in each one of the boots and tightening the 10mm fasteners by hand first into the cylinder head before going back in with gentle battery power. And that's what they look like installed. And we also have new wires, thank goodness. And I'll be doing the same thing inside each one of these little boots. I like to lay them down in their proper orientation first before I clip them into place, and this allows me to place them the way that I want them before committing to snapping them in place. I did try salvaging the plastic clips off of the original wires, but alas, they all crumbled in my hands. No big deal, I'll just make my own once the wire harness is done. I arranged the wires the way I wanted them to go, and then I pressed each one of them down into place and verified a secure connection. Here's the final layout. Also, my new PCV valve came in, so let's get that installed. Getting it nice and snug and facing the proper direction. There we go. Okay, time to tackle this terrible wire harness. Here are my new pigtails. I ended up pulling every single one of these wires back into the harness where they were protected by that plastic sleeve. I kept clipping the wires back further and further and further and kept finding brittle, crumpling insulation and corroded wires. Literally green, flaky corrosion covering the wires. I clipped and clipped and clipped until the wire was clean and then replaced the entire length of wire. I used different colors for each signal wire, which are ground side controlled, for each coil, and black wire for the shared power wires, which were black with a white stripe from the factory. You know, I almost didn't include this part of rebuilding the wire harness because I just didn't have the energy to deal with the comments from people who think they know better, telling me to solder these wires rather than using butt connectors. But then I didn't want to rob this footage from people who genuinely wanted to see how I performed this repair. But seriously, don't waste your finger energy running to the keyboard to tell me that you know better. Listen, perform your own repairs however you want to, but this is the way that I do it. I'm performing this repair the factory recommended Toyota way. And actually, this is the same way that we're taught to repair wiring on the new Supra as well. So this is a BMW approved method for repairing wire harnesses also. Oh, and come to think about it, this is actually the way that High Performance Academy teaches wiring. And in their classes, they do reference that this is a highly debated topic. They briefly cover the pros and cons and recommend using a barrel crimp method as opposed to soldering due to the failure rate being much, much lower with this style connector. So don't tell me I'm not doing it right. I absolutely am. And if you want to fight someone about it, why don't you bring it up to the Toyota and BMW engineers who are determining the best way to repair wires with the least chance of failure, since their companies have to pay warranty repair costs? Or why don't you bring it up to the professional instructors at HP Academy who literally do this for a living? Am I spicy about this? Absolutely. I'm just so sick of the idiots in the comments telling me I'm doing it wrong. I'm not. Your knowledge is outdated, and I'm guessing you don't do this professionally. Okay, moving on. Here's the end result. You can see I just used little zip ties to make the little dividers because those just crumbled in my hands, but I still wanted them to be sort of neat and out of the way. So there we go. I'm still gonna wrap this part up and then let's get that intake manifold back on and send this thing. Now, if you're a veteran of my channel, then you know exactly what I'm about to say. Installation is just the reverse of removal. I will report though that I did remember to go back and reroute that oxygen sensor wiring so it was no longer hitting the exhaust manifold. So that's a plus. Also, I did replace the PCV hose with a new section of bulk hose as well, so the customer did get a couple freebie bonuses in there. Also, while editing this footage, almost a week after this vehicle left the shop, I realized that I never filmed an outro and a conclusion to this video. Oops! So I guess I'll thank you guys for watching now as I'm wrapping up this install. Also, the owner has reported that the car runs smoother and better than ever after these repairs. No more misfiring, and it has started up reliably ever since. So we can say with confidence that we addressed the issue. Huge thanks to those who support my channel and leave positive comments for me. I really appreciate you. Thank you to everyone for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!
Oh, you. Oh, you want to join in too, Delilah? So tempting.